Respected viewers and listeners, Assalamu alaikum. Today I am going to present chapter 2 of the book Untold Islam. The chapter 2 relates to Hazrat Jafar ibn Abi Talib, Jafar Tayyar. Jafar was the third son of Abu Talib ibn Abdul Muttalib and Fatima bint Asad, hence a cousin of Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His elder brothers were Talib and Aqil. His younger brother was Hazrat Ali. One should notice the Jafar's majestic youth and blooming vigor, patience, compassion, piety, modesty, devoutness, fearlessness, generosity, purity, chastity, honesty, and trustworthiness, his magnificent nature, virtue, and greatness. He resembled the Holy Prophet in his looks and conduct. The Prophet gave him the epithet Father of the Poor and the agnomen the Two-Winged. The migration to Abyssinia. Hijrat-e-Habshah, also known as the first Hijrat, was an episode in the early history of Islam where Prophet Muhammad's first followers, the Sahaba, fled from the persecution of the ruling Quraysh tribe of Mecca. They sought refuge in the Christian kingdom of Aksum, present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, formerly referred to be Abyssinia, a name derived from the Arabic al-Habshah. The Aksumite monarch who received them is known in Islamic sources as Negus, in Arabic Najashi, Ashma ibn Abjar. Some of the exiles returned to Mecca and made the hijrat to Medina with Holy Prophet, while others remained in Abyssinia until they came to Medina in 628 AD. When the apostle of God saw the sufferings of his companions, he said to them, "If you go to Abyssinia, it would be better for you, for the king will not tolerate injustice, and it is friendly country until such time as Allah shall relieve you from your distress." Thereupon his companions, 83 men and 18 women in all, went to Abyssinia, being afraid of apostasy and fleeing to God with their religion. This was the first hijrat in Islam. The king of Abyssinia welcomed the Muslim refugees from Mecca into his kingdom. He gave them sanctuary and they enjoyed peace, security, and freedom of worship under his aegis. Some of the historians say that about a year later, the Muslims in Abyssinia heard rumors that the Quraysh in Mecca had accepted Islam. If it was true, then there was no reason for them to live in exile. They were back home, but when they arrived in Mecca, they found out that not only the rumors they had heard were false, but also that the Quraysh had stepped up the persecution of the Muslims. They therefore left Mecca once again. Many other Muslims also accompanied them. This new group of Muhajirin comprised of 83 men and 18 women. The Holy Prophet Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam appointed his first cousin Jafar ibn Abi Talib, an elder brother of Hazrat Ali, as the leader of Muhajirin. This second migration of Muslims to Abyssinia is said to have taken place in the 6th year of proclamation, which corresponds to the year 616 AD. The migration of the Muslims to Abyssinia and their reception at the friendly court of that country alarmed the Quraysh. They entertained the fear that Muslims might grow in strength and find new allies, and then someday might return to Mecca to challenge them. To end this potential threat, such as they saw it, they decided to send an embassy to the court of King of Abyssinia to try to persuade him to extradite the Muslim Muhajirin to Mecca. They selected two envoys, Amr bin As and Abdullah bin Rabia, and gave them gifts for the king and his generals. The gifts were made up of leather prepared by fine skin, because Abyssinians were fond of leather goods, so it was, in other words, a bribe for them. The emperor of Abyssinia, Negus, was an enlightened believer. Deep inside him embraced a rational and pure Christianity, void of deviation, fanaticism, and narrow-mindedness. He was renowned and highly admired for his justice. Hence, the Prophet, peace be upon him, chose his country for his companions' emigration. The Quraysh were afraid that they should not be able to convince the king of their viewpoint. Therefore, the two delegates carried many expensive gifts for the bishops and archbishops of the church, and were advised not to meet Najashi until they had given those presents to the bishops and archbishops and convinced them of their viewpoints, so that they would support them before al-Najashi. As soon as the two delegates arrived in Abyssinia, they met the spiritual leaders and lavished the gifts on them. Afterwards, they began to incite the priests and bishops against the Muslim emigrants and asked them to support them in their plea to al-Najashi to expel them. Then they sent al-Najashi his presents. A day was set for Muslims to meet al-Najashi and confront before his eyes their spiteful, unpleasant, and mischievous enemies. Court of Najashi. The king gave audience to the emissary of the Quraysh. They said that the Muslims in Abyssinia were not refugees from persecution, but were fugitives and absconders from justice and law, and requested him to extradite them to Mecca. The king, however, wanted to hear the other side of the story also before giving any judgment, and summoned Jafar ibn Abi Talib to the court to answer the charges against the Muslims. Jafar made a most memorable defense. On the appointed day, al-Najashi sat on the throne in awesome dignity, surrounded by the bishops and his retinue. Right in front of him in the vast hall sat the Muslim immigrants, enveloped by Allah's calmness, tranquility, and mercy which the Allah had sent down upon them. The two Quraysh delegates stood to reiterate their accusation, which they had presented before al-Najashi in a private meeting right before his huge audience. According to Washington Irving, among the refugees to Abyssinia, there was Jafar, the son of Abu Talib and brother of Ali, consequently the cousin of Muhammad. He was a man of persuasive eloquence and a most prepossessing, handsome appearance. He stood forth before the king of Abyssinia and expounded the doctrines of Islam with zeal and power. His speech was an example of winning souls is converting men. The speech of Hazrat Jafar ibn Abi Talib in the court of the king of Abyssinia was to answer to the questions posed to him. O king, we were ignorant people and we lived like wild animals. The strong among us lived by preying upon the weak. We obeyed no law and we acknowledged no authority save that the brute force. We worshipped idols made of stone or wood, and we knew nothing of human dignity. And then God, in His mercy, sent to us His messenger, who was himself one of us. We knew about his truthfulness and his integrity. His character was exemplary and he was the well-born of the Arabs. He invited us towards the worship of one God and he forbade us to worship idols. He exhorted us to tell the truth and to protect the weak, the poor, the humble, the widows and the orphans. He ordered us to show respect to women and never to slander them. We obeyed him and followed his teachings. Most of the people in our country are still polytheists, and they resented our conversion to the new faith, which is called Islam. They began to persecute us, and it was in order to escape from persecution by them that we sought and found sanctuary in your kingdom. When Jafar concluded his speech, the king asked him to read some verses which were revealed to the Prophet of Muslims. Jafar read a few verses from Surah Maryam, the 9th chapter of Holy Quran. When the king heard these verses, he said that their fountain head was the same as that of the verses of Evangel, the Gospels. He then declared that he was convinced of his veracity and said to Amr bin As that the Muslims were free to live in his kingdom for as long as they wished. But Amr ibn As considered a new strategy, about which he was confident that it would tilt the scale against Jafar. On the following day, therefore, he returned to the court and said to the king that he, means the king, ought to waive his protection of the Muslims because they rejected the divine nature of Christ and claimed that he was a mortal like other men. The king summoned them again and questioned on this point. Considering the sensitivity of the question, Jafar thought about the question and decided to answer the question according to the teachings of Holy Prophet and Quran without considering the consequences of it. Jafar said, "Our judgment of Jesus is the same as that of Allah and His Messenger, with Jesus is God's servant, His prophet, His spirit, and His command given unto Mary, the innocent virgin." Then the king said, "Jesus is just what you have stated him to be and is nothing more than that." Then addressing the Muslims, he said, go to your homes and live in peace. I shall never give you up to your enemies. He refused to extradite the Muslims, returned the presents which Amr ibn As had brought, and dismissed his embassy. Jafar and his wife Asma spent about 10 years in Abyssinia, which became a second home for them. There, Asma gave birth to 3 children, whom they named Abdullah, Muhammad, and On. Their second child, Muhammad, was possibly the first child in the history of Muslim Ummah to be given the name Muhammad after the noble prophet. May God bless him and grant him peace. Jafar ibn Abi Talib was the leader of all those Muslims who had migrated to Abyssinia in 615 and 616. He appears to have been the only member of the clan of Bani Hashim to leave for Abyssinia with the other refugees. All other members of Bani Hashim stayed in Mecca. Muslims spent many years in Abyssinia and lived there in peace. Overseas preaching. Jafar ibn Abi Talib was one of the Sahabas who left Abyssinia in 614-15 for overseas preaching and later returned to Abyssinia by the same route. It is said Jafar ibn Abi Talib accompanied Saad ibn Waqas and other Sahabas in their mission to Chittagong, Manipur, Tibet, Khotan, China region. Preaching in Khotan. Khotan, also known as Khotan or Hotan, is a town in the southern branch of the Silk Road in Xinjiang province in China. Khotan was once center of Buddhist empire built on an oasis. Khotan's mulberry groves allowed the production and export of silks and carpets, as well as notable source of jade and ornamental stone for carvings and jewelry in ancient China. The Muslims of Khotan, west of Tibet, China, trace their origin to Jafar ibn Abi Talib. Similarly, the Muslims of Chams, Cambodia, also trace their origin to father-in-law of Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is Jahash, the father of Zainab, wife of Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Chinese Muslims dedicated a mausoleum in the Hami, 400 miles east of Urumqi in Xinjiang, to Jahash. Memory is said to be as Jahash tomb by their later generations. Return to Medina. 13 years later, in 7 Hijri, 628 AD, they returned not to Mecca but to Medina. Their arrival synchronized with the conquest of Khaybar by Muslims. The Prophet was so overjoyed at meeting Jafar that he said, I do not know what fills me with more happiness, the conquest of Khaybar or the coming of Jafar. Muslims in general and the poor among them especially were just as happy with the return of Jafar as the Prophet was. Jafar quickly became known as a person who was much concerned for the welfare of the poor and indigent. For this, he was nicknamed the father of the poor. Respected listeners and viewers, the first part of this chapter is read today. Inshallah, the second part will be read and presented before you very soon. In the last but not the least, I will request to the listeners and viewers that kindly share and like this video as much as possible, and as well as those who have yet not subscribed this channel, may kindly subscribe this channel. Thank you. Salamun alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.